pleasure for me to welcome all of you to today's webinar titled Building a Climate-Ready Indian State. This is a particularly important conversation because it seeks to ask provocative questions about the governance architecture for addressing the challenge of climate. I think this is a question that we don't ask enough. What we hope to do through the course of today's conversation is explore first, what should be the approach for climate reform, essentially pushing the envelope to ask whether climate-related issues should be addressed primarily through the silos of the Ministry of Environment and Forests, or ought it to be an all-of-government approach? There is almost every aspect of public policy and government that has a crucial bearing on climate targets. So what does it mean then for a institutional architecture that is used to operating largely in silos to break those silos and think differently about an all-of-government approach that coordinates and deliberates across silos to address the challenge of climate? This also brings to bear two very important questions, which are at the core, I think, of climate institutions, that of the role of the center and the role of the states. Our federal architecture has always tended towards a far more centralized approach. And I think across the board, climate and otherwise, one of the most fundamental governance challenges that India confronts and hasn't yet resolved is what level of government should be performing what kind of function. As we think forward to climate governance, which in many ways is at the core of a 21st century state, the question of what the center should do, what the states should do, how the center and state should coordinate with one another, and very, very importantly, how states should coordinate across each other. After all, climate does not know state boundaries, is a crucial question that we need to address. And if we address it up front, perhaps we will be in a place where we can create institutional structures that have longevity, capability to respond to the crucial challenges of climate as we move forward. To discuss these issues, the Center for Policy Research's Initiative of Climate, Energy and Environment has put together a set of briefing reports, and Aditya Pillai will kick us off by laying out some of the key arguments and institutional structures that they have been articulating over the first 10 or 12 minutes. This will be followed by a panel discussion with Jairam Ramesh, Dr. Indira Rajaraman, and Navroz Dubash. All three panelists need no introduction, but I shall go through the formalities nonetheless. Jairam Ramesh is currently a member of the Rajya Sabha and was former union minister in the Ministry of Environment and Forests and has been a long-term friend, supporter, mentor, advisor to the center and particularly to our work on environment and climate. Of late, we've been engaging with Jairam and learning from him as Jairam the historian, Jairam the author, Jairam the philosopher. In fact, we had a wonderful talk with him only 2 weeks ago on his latest book. So it's wonderful to have you back on the CPR platform, Jairam, this time to talk about environment. As we discussed last time, we'd have you back very soon. I thought that would be faster on your next book, but CPR's briefing reports got ahead of your book writing. So for once, we are able to bring you back to talk about some of our publications rather than the other way around. Dr. Indira Rajaraman, who's a former member of the 13th Finance Commission and one of India's foremost voices on public finance and the economy, to talk about the institutional dynamics that we are contending with as we confront the challenge of climate. Dr. Rajaraman has also been, like Jairam Ramesh, a real mentor and advisor to many of our programs at the center. I personally have learned a lot from you about public finance and about the challenges of fiscal federalism. And in some ways, as we wrap our heads around the question of climate, many of the things we have talked about and what we have learned from you about the institutional challenges of fiscal federal institutions came back in our conversation. So looking forward to learning from you. And of course, Navroz Dubash, a professor at the Center for Policy Research and and who's been at the forefront of thinking about climate and one of India's foremost researchers on climate change and the environment, but also crucial to many of the briefs and issues that we'll be discussing through the course of today's webinar. So to start us off, I'm going to hand over to Aditya to kick us off. Thanks.
Thank you, Yamini. Just to make sure that the presentation's up and running, can you see it? Yeah, I think, okay, there. Yeah, thanks very much, Yamini. And thanks everyone for joining on this rainy Friday evening here in Delhi, joining from wherever you are. We'll start things off with a very short presentation to just set up this discussion. So it's in two parts, really. The first part will be about national level institutions and governance, and the second part will be about state level institutions in the federal structure. We have a stimulating panel after this, as Yamini mentioned, so we'll segue right into that, hopefully provoke a conversation through this presentation. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. The key to this really is to ask, why should we talk about this right now? What really is the point of revisiting India's climate institutions? In some senses, things are going swimmingly well because we have an array of climate policies dotting the mitigation and adaptation landscape. So why tweak and tinker with the nuts and bolts of this? Why look at the ministries and agencies and coordination bodies and laws and processes at the heart of Indian climate governance? And the key to this is to think about India's developmental moment. India has a fairly long way to go before it peaks. And it needs an institution or institutions to mediate that growth trajectory, to make sure that there are no long-term carbon lock-ins that are hard to get out of later. So it's essentially about making sure our future is low carbon. And that can't be done through scattershot or ad hoc institutions. And the second part is about the global moment we're in. International society is now increasingly seized by the climate issue. And for global leaders, it is increasingly more important now to look back at their domestic systems and show that they have something credible in place. And so this is also motivated by the fact that India's leadership credentials on the global stage are very much hinged on the credibility of its domestic institutions. At the core of our thinking is the fact that climate change, as Yamini mentioned, is an all-of-government issue. It's not something that is the domain of a single ministry. It needs to be spread out across government with responsibilities, not only spread across national government, but also to the states as well, and a robust interface between the center and states. And to drive the entire machine, all these moving parts, there has to be a strategic backbone, a thought at the center of it that is well analyzed and well constructed, that makes sure that this orchestra is actually playing a symphony and not just caterwauling. And so these are the coordination challenges we're hoping to address. And this is coming on the back of a history of very inconsistent institutions. So there was a strategic body called the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change that hasn't met since 2015. The Special Envoy's Office for Climate Change in the Prime Minister's office was disbanded in 2009. The Executive Committee on Climate Change, which is a high-powered body of bureaucrats meant for top-down bureaucratic coordination, has met very inconsistently over the last decade. So it is very infirm institutional grounding that we're basing these proposals on, and we're hoping to redress. And of course, there are these interministerial hierarchies, most notably the fact that the Ministry of Environment controls the climate portfolio and constantly has to negotiate with larger ministries like finance and power and so on and so forth. And the fact that India's climate federalism is not well developed and fairly inconsistent itself. We had these state action plans on climate change that haven't really gone too far in recent years. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. How do we think about redesigning these institutions? And the key here is really to focus on those words, low carbon development pathways. What we're trying to convey is the fact that the decisions we make now create a pathway for low carbon development in the future. So to use a very simple example, the sort of choices we make in mobility will decide the future shape of cities, which then decides how state governments respond to that, and then decides our carbon intensity and also the sort of strategic resources we need in place decades into the future. And so it is fully seizing the temporal nature of climate, of climate policy that sits at the core of our institutional proposals. But as this example also demonstrated, it's about integrating across sectors and also across government scales, urban development being something that the states and local governments handle. And as you would have guessed, the core of all of this is having analysis and information that drives these policy suggestions and strategies across various sectors. And that's really what the institutional imagination, which I'll lay out next, is about. And picking up from the last slide, we've had this inconsistent history. So we need something that's far more stable and able to steer the ship of state and economy better, but also something that's just about flexible enough to evolve with changing climate circumstances, not only in India's carbon emissions, but also with India's adaptation needs. Next one, please. So at the heart of this is, one more slide. Yeah, at the heart of this is this Low Carbon Development Commission. So this organogram basically lists all the various ministries that all the various ministries and bodies and agencies and processes that constitute climate governance at the national level. And the heart of this is the Low Carbon Development Commission. And this is the body that we think will be able to inject analysis, credible analysis and strategy into the systems and processes of the government of India. It is a non-executive body. That's what we proposed. It is backed by law and it's independent. And so its power really comes from the credibility of its analysis and its ability to inject ideas, not only into government, but also public conversation and steer the conversation in the direction of slightly more pragmatic and better thought through ideas. And so the composition of this is it will have a set of commissioners at the top, and this would be a representative body of commissioners drawn from various walks of life, expert commissioners that are drawn from sciences, public policy, but also media and civil society, all of whom have a fair degree of expert grounding, as I mentioned. And they'll be backed up by a technical core, an analytical core, secretariat that conducts these analyses and puts things out in the public domain. And the whole idea is to legitimize certain ideas, move the conversation, but also to be a resource to all the various line ministries this is connected with and to the states. Next slide. Around this LCDC are the existing, the vestiges of the previous climate governance regime, which is the Executive Committee on Climate Change, which I mentioned earlier, which is a committee of senior secretaries that sort of moves the bureaucratic system to their sway. We call for the expansion of climate cells so that every ministry has a climate brain embedded within it. And this was sort of unevenly done during the days of the National Action Plan on Climate Change. We call for an expansion of this. And the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change continues to play an important role representing India on the international stage, conducting the MRV functions, the monitoring, reporting, and verification functions, and so on. So it's working with the grain of the existing system, with a view towards durability and stability. Next slide, please. So just to sort of summarize, these are what we think are the three main climate governance challenges, right? So at the core of it, like I mentioned multiple times, strategy setting, and the LCDC sort of leads on that front. But it also does that by being open to various opinions. Now, if you look at the top of this diagram on the side, you'll see the stakeholders, the states and various ministries inform and collaborate in the creation of the LCDC strategic low carbon development pathways. So the idea of the LCDC is very much to also build consensus, given that climate arises all of these passions across all of society and is inherently a political issue. And finally, we have the coordination bodies, which is the Executive Committee of Climate Change, which comes under the PMO, and the various ministries which have to coordinate amongst themselves. Next slide. This picture is incomplete without a conversation about the states, and I'll very quickly run you through our vision for the states. And the entire thing really hinges on this idea of structured opportunism. And to explain it very simply, it's the idea that we need to create a bunch of institutions that allow the states to experiment, talk to each other, and diffuse good policy ideas, but at the same time have enough structure within this governance framework that we have a coherent national pathway. So it's really a tricky balancing act, obviously. And so we propose these changes at 3 levels of government. So the states at the center and between the center and states, so these federal institutions. The center's role in all of this is obviously very important given India's famously top-heavy system of federalism. And so we call for the center to provide these public goods. So in the previous slides, we talked about the strategy and the strategic frameworks the center could provide that the states then respond to. Knowledge resources, notably in the form of central universities and various state agencies like the IITM, and information flows that allow the states to really think through their policies more efficiently, because they may not have the bodies and the ability to create and generate their own information for analysis. Next slide, please. Broadly speaking, they're bunched under 3 groupings. The simplest one, but perhaps the most important really, is about augmenting state capacities. The first and most basic step is really creating nodal climate departments in the state and specialized climate personnel. It is a heavy lift given the revenue implications of this, but we think it's something that needs to be put in place. Like I said earlier, centralized knowledge resources like the LCDC, the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, and various central universities already play an important role in state climate policy making, need to be foregrounded. We talk about improved coordination, and this is not just about coordination bodies between center-state coordination bodies. It really is about having processes that allow this coordination to happen. We envision the SAPCCs, if you mandate them to be sort of regularly updated plans, these could be vehicles for center-state coordination as the center and state sort of engage in iterations that respond to each other's plans. And this could even be pegged actually to the India's international pledges. But at the same time, the LCDC was supposed to be a deliberative body. There are existing sectoral mechanisms that need to be moved towards climate ends. This includes a forum of electricity regulators, an annual meeting of energy ministers, and so on and so forth. And in our brief, we even sort of dangle, sort of controversially, the idea of reviving the Interstate Council towards climate ends, which may not be very realistic, but it's just to say that there are a bunch of bodies there that could play this role, and climate doesn't have to be an exclusive climate-only body. There are existing mechanisms that can play this role. And finally, we talk about sharpening incentives. And this is really key to get the states to motivate the states into climate action, both in mitigation and adaptations. We talk about having clear, unambiguous funding for the SAPCCs, which created a lot of confusion and diminishing enthusiasm in the last round. We propose also trying to green essentially sponsored schemes and sort of encourage the Finance Commission, which has already been quite climate sensitive in the 15th Commission, to continue moving down that path. And this is essentially to say that there are low-hanging fruits in Indian fiscal federalism that could be tapped. And finally, in recognition states need to talk to each other, we say that the center has an important role to play in funding multi-state efforts and therefore incentivizing things like river basin projects, transboundary efforts that currently don't really aren't very attractive to the states because the political incentives aren't there. Yeah, that's Yamini. How much time do I have? I'm guessing I'm over. 2 minutes. Okay, so great. Then I can summarize very quickly for you. So the overall approach was to work with the grain. We're not proposing anything. We're not proposing an institutional overhaul. It's about using existing systems and institutions and tweaking them at the margins, trying to make sure they work better. And the core idea here is that institutions that are alienated from their political context usually don't survive. And that's why we've taken this approach. The idea is to enable and incentivize climate considerations within ministries, within local governments, within the states. At the core of all this, across the center and the states, was the idea of expanded climate capacity, which we saw in the LCDC, but also in the climate cells and nodal departments in the states and so on and so forth. And all of this capacity is essentially oriented towards creating a credible long-term strategic path for the country. And that's where this low carbon development pathway concept really comes up, in the sense that it needs to be temporally grounded and consider India's carbon future rather than just addressing immediate political needs or technological opportunities. And we've created a bunch of process drivers to make sure that this system actually keeps moving and innovating and renewing itself. So we talked about ministerial reports to Parliament. That's in the first brief. We talked about Parliament playing an important oversight role in how the ministries respond to not only long-term national strategies, but increasing pressure on mitigation. The LCDC reviews these reports. And finally, we talk about the SAPCCs being mandatorily updated and leading to a virtuous cycle of national coordination, apart from the states actually moving their needle on both mitigation and adaptation. There is the deliberative function, which we've sort of laid out through the course of this, but the real core node is LCDC, this body that we propose that will have input from states and various other stakeholders, including ministries and external stakeholders, coordination bodies at all three levels, and a range of financial incentives to make sure that particularly the states are motivated to do more. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aditya, for laying this out so succinctly. I think we're now ready to dive straight in to our conversation. What we'll do is perhaps request our panelists to offer some opening remarks for a couple of minutes, just to get the conversation going, and then we'll do a few rounds of questions. And to the audience, we will take questions towards the last 20 minutes to half an hour of the conversation. So please do put in your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll find ways of integrating it into our conversation. Let me start with you, Jairam. In many ways, Aditya's last slide says, thinking about the institutional environment for a climate-ready state, that the architecture they're proposing is trying to work within the grain of Indian governance. But what they're asking to do for this to work is coordination, deliberation, fiscal incentives. Is the Indian state ready for this? Because it seems to me that this is actually quite a radical shift from its business as usual model.
Well, Yamini, first of all, let me say that I'm delighted that we are using the word low carbon today without being squeamish about using it. When I first proposed this low carbon strategy in 2011, exactly 10 years ago, I was met with mountains of opposition in the government, in civil society, and amongst academics. And finally, a working group was set up in the erstwhile Planning Commission under Kirit Parikh's chairmanship, of which Navroz was a very distinguished member. And that report was submitted in 2014. And that was the first time really we looked at low carbon development strategy and what it means for GDP growth and so on and so forth. So I'm delighted that low carbon is being used without being defensive, without being squeamish. And we are being upfront about it because India, let me make it absolutely clear, India cannot afford a no carbon strategy, but India has to move to a low carbon strategy. And, because of our demographics, because of our developmental challenge, a no carbon strategy makes absolutely no sense. But a low carbon is desirable, it's also feasible. So that's my first remark. The second remark, which I've made to Navroz and his colleagues, I think they're putting the cart before the horse. You're creating an institutional structure. You're suggesting institutional innovations and frameworks without clarity on what is the substance of the governance. It's all very well to say that we must have a governance structure, but to govern what? What are we doing? What are the concrete interventions that we are proposing in mitigation and in adaptation, which require institutional structures? By the way, I don't think there's a unique institutional framework, for dealing with the multiple challenges we have on the climate front. We have to have flexible frameworks, and that those frameworks will be dependent on what you're trying to actually achieve, both on the mitigation as well as the adaptation. So my view, I don't want to be rude, but I've said this to Navroz, is that all this is very well, but what are you governing? What is this framework for? If you don't have clarity on that, then this is, it's not going to add much value. Thirdly, and flowing out of the second point, whatever we do, low carbon development has to be embedded in an overall developmental framework. Now, if you had a planning commission, the best place to locate this would have been in a planning commission type of a structure. Now it's been replaced by a Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog was very fundamentally different from the planning commission. But nevertheless, with all its infirmities, I have made my view very clear to Navroz that to be effective, low carbon developmental strategies have to flow out of an overall macroeconomic approach, overall economic strategy. What are we doing in agriculture? What are we doing on transport? What are we doing on energy? What are we doing on the commercial sector? And that is really the bailiwick jurisdiction of the Niti Aayog. So whatever we do in terms of low carbon has to be embedded in this larger structure of developmental planning. As I said, with all its shortcomings, with all its infirmities, the Niti Aayog really, a Niti Aayog type of a body, is the best place to have this think tank. I look upon the LCDC as a think tank. It cannot be a do tank, it's a think tank, which is generating the options for interventions, both at the central level and at the state level. Finally, I'll say I'm in sympathy with this, with the argument that we need governance structures at multiple levels. We need a governance structure at the federal, at the central level, at the union level. We need a governance structure at state level. And one of the great lessons we have learned from COVID-19 is that we need governance structures at the local level, particularly at the city level. I mean, if, for example, if you're going to deal with the issue of urban heat, which is one of the very important issues that arise out of global warming and climate change, the structure can't be at the federal level or at the state level. It has to be at the local level. Ahmedabad has to be empowered institutionally, financially, and organizationally to deal with the problem of urban heat in Ahmedabad or Vijayawada or Bombay, as the case may be. So I'm sympathetic to this argument that we need these multiple levels of governance, at the union level, at the state level, and particularly at the city, at the local government level, either through panchayats or nagar palikas. Now, the 73rd Amendment, Indira is a walking expert on this. We've been successful on the 73rd Amendment, I would say, relatively more than we have been on the 74th Amendment. Really, the 74th Amendment hasn't accomplished much. The 73rd has, and as former rural development minister, I can tell you that the 73rd Amendment has really made a difference to the implementation of programs like Mahatma Gandhi Narega and the National Rural Livelihood Mission. But I can't say the same thing about the 74th Amendment. So I think we need to look at the local government structures far more than what Navroz and his colleagues have put together in these papers. But let me end by saying that, these are, I'm looking at it as a critic from the outside, but it's a very valuable contribution because they put together, I think for the first time, drawing from international experience, how India should gear itself up to deal with the multiple challenges of climate change, global warming, and so on and so forth. By the way, I can't help saying that climate change is only one of the challenges that we face on the planetary boundaries front. We have other issues. We have the problems of ozone depletion, ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity, deforestation, which are not necessarily directly linked, or aerosol particulate pollution in the atmosphere, which is not necessarily linked directly to the issue of climate change. But we are looking at the climate change architecture from which perhaps we can derive lessons for the management of other planetary boundaries as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks. You provoked us appropriately, and Navroz, looking forward to hearing your responses, particularly to the question of what that Jairam Ramesh raised about the substance of governance that we need to be thinking about. But before I come to you, Indira, I was very keen to hear from you, both your overall response to the presentation and the institutional architecture that they're laying out, your views on the sort of principles of deliberation and coordination, which I do think go against the grain of the way the business as usual model. If you could just touch upon the fiscal federal architecture that there's, because that's at the core of the sort of incentive structure that is the base of the institutional architecture that they've laid out. And I hope we can dig into that a little more in the next round as well. So over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Can I be heard?
Yes.
How much time do I have, Yamini? And will you signal me when I'm sort of 1 minute away from the end of it? What is it? 5 minutes, 7 minutes?
Yeah, about 5 minutes, so that we can have a couple more rounds of conversation.
Okay. So let me begin by commending Navroz Dubash and his co-authors, Aditya Pillai and Parth Bhatia, for having brought out these two documents for us to discuss. It's certainly useful to have some documentation at the center of what we're talking about. Summarizing the first draft report, what they recommend is a low carbon development commission, a standalone commission, which will have statutory backing, presumably an act of parliament, which will take time, by the way. It's not something that can be done overnight. And it will have these commissioners, it'll have a director, it'll have technical staff, and it will then feed its low carbon pathway into an executive committee on climate change, which will operate either within the Prime Minister's office or with the backing of the Prime Minister's office. And then that ECCC will radio its mandates, I guess, to the nodal ministry, which is the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. And that is how they perceive the governance necessary to bring about movement towards climate targets. So that is at the core of this first draft. Now they justify their recommendation for a standalone commission on the grounds that we have a human rights commission, we have a competition commission, and so why can't we have a low carbon development commission? But as all the speakers have pointed out, and Yamini began with that, a low carbon pathway is very different from human rights or competition. Human rights can be focused on very narrowly, independent of what is going on in other sectors of the economy. The Competition Commission, too, at any time focuses on a particular sector that it is examining in terms of the competitive outcomes in that sector, but it doesn't have to simultaneously take account of what is happening in all the other sectors. Climate change is a very, very different matter. It's a very different cup of tea. There, you cannot move without taking simultaneously with a very least 5 ministries or 5 sectors of policy into consideration. You have to take account of what is happening to transportation in the economy, the modal mix in transportation. Even more importantly, you have to look at power sector reform. As your document says, 42% of all emissions are accounted for by by the power sector. Then you have to take account of taxation policy within the Ministry of Finance. You have to take on board obviously what is happening in the area of forests, because that is very key to a low carbon policy. You have to look at what is happening in urbanization. And you cannot privilege any one of these. You have to take all of them into account simultaneously. Now, and here is where I totally agree with Jairam Ramesh. I don't see how that simultaneity can be achieved in any institution other than the Niti Aayog. Remember that the T in Niti Aayog is about transforming India. And as a result, the Niti Aayog, which inherited the technicians and the policy experts and so on of the Planning Commission, looks at all these sectors. It looks at transportation, it looks at the power sector, it looks at all of these. Now, if this low carbon cell were embedded within the Niti Aayog, it would find it much easier to engage with these other cells. They would just be down the corridor, and they would also have built up pre-existing channels of communication with the relevant line ministries. So all in all, this cell, if embedded in Niti Aayog, would find it much easier to transact its job, to actually work. Whereas if you were to have an LCDC of the kind that you visualize, it would be a new kid on the block. It would not have any of these pre-existing channels of communication. If it were to try to engage with the transportation cell or the power sector reform cell of Niti Aayog, it may not find any cooperation forthcoming. The line ministries in turn, they're very jealous of their turf and they might not engage. Most of all, and this is extremely important in federal India, you say that they're going to engage with stakeholders, including very importantly, the states. Now, remember that the governing council of the Niti Aayog actually has all state chief ministers as members. So when the Niti Aayog convenes a meeting of state officials looking at any one of these 5 policy areas, which are critically important to low carbon, those states will actually respond. They will cooperate because actually Niti Aayog, by virtue of its governing council, including all state chief ministers, is actually a federal institution. I don't think you have given enough credit to the Niti Aayog for its federal character. It is a standing federal institution, just as the GST Council is a standing federal institution in another sphere. So from these points of view, I do think that, as Jairam Ramesh said, I think this whole issue can be much more effectively handled in terms of feasibility, in terms of smoothness, than a standalone commission, a new commission, which would generate a lot of antis in the system. There are a lot of people who would try to debunk this new commission and make it ineffective. Now, to do the authors of these drafts justice, they have actually considered in the first draft the alternative of nesting the cell within Niti Aayog. And let me read out what they say. They say it risks subjecting the LCDC to the pressures of short-term decision-making if it were nested within Niti Aayog, and global political positioning and undercutting independence. I don't know why you think that the Niti Aayog is necessarily short-term in its deliberations. Maybe you know something that I don't know. But as far as I know, the Niti Aayog is looking at the medium and long term, in addition, of course, to the short term. I don't know what you mean by global political positioning. And about undercutting independence, yes, the Niti Aayog is an arm of government. It has the Prime Minister as the chairman. The members are all ministers of state at the national level. To that extent, maybe the independence of this cell might be curtailed. But on the other hand, its work would be facilitated. If the LCDC is independent, but is simply unable to carry out its work because of lack of cooperation from the state governments or from other line ministries or from the Niti Aayog departments of transportation and power, what could it achieve? It wouldn't be able to achieve anything. So I think you have to think through once again the institutional structure, whether you really want to have this kind of an independent commission or use pre-existing structures and try to strengthen them. If I'm not out of time, I'll go on to the second draft. Shall I go on to the second draft?
Yes, sure. I think very quickly, so then we can respond, because you are out of time, but I'll give you a couple of minutes.
Sure. I could skip the second draft too, if you like. I mean, it's all up to you.
Okay, maybe Navroz, you can respond to this, and then we can come back in more detail to the federal question in the next round of Q&A. So Navroz, lots of questions for you. Both our fellow panelists have, in some senses, posed provocative questions to you to respond to. But I think in particular, this larger question of the substance of governance that we're talking about, and then in response to the location of the LCDC and why you felt that the Niti Aayog may not be the appropriate home. That could kick us off into the next round on federalism. So over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Yamini, and thank you in particular to Mr. Ramesh and Professor Rajaraman. It's been a robust pushback, which is of course what we want, and the only way to honor the robustness of the pushback is for the pushback to be equally robust. And I will just say that in some ways, I think sprinkled through both Jairam's and Indira's comments is the seeds of the answer to them, and the reason why we took the course we did. So let me try and lay bare some of those. First, in terms of to govern what. Now, several of us, and notably Jairam, have been observing climate governance for a long time. And what we have observed is that when policies are put in place under the rubric of climate change, they tend to be incredibly knee-jerk. They tend not to be strategic. They tend not to be very stable. They kind of switch with the winds. There's no long-term perspective on it. And so what we need actually is not a direct switch into implementation mode. So to govern what implies that we know already which direction we want to go to. We're just building a mechanism to get there. Actually, the need is to figure out where we want to go and how it is consistent with our developmental story. We don't have a strategy. We have a word, co-benefits, which has been very useful, which I have milked to death academically and otherwise, and many people have made a lot of use of it, but we don't know how to operationalize that. When we say we want to move to a low carbon development pathway, and low carbon is a term that is now, as Mr. Ramesh said, won approval, what does that concretely mean? As Indira said, in agriculture, in urbanization, in industry, etc. It's a very complex question. What do low carbon trajectories in each of these areas mean, and what do they add up to? We actually don't know the answer to those questions. We need a mechanism, and this is not just a technical question, it's a political question. Every time you say, let's have EVs for transport, somebody else will say, no, let's have public transport. If you have public transport and EVs are electric vehicles, do you start with cars? Do you start with trucks? Do you start with two-wheelers? What are the implications of all of that in terms of manufacturing? Do we invest in battery technology or not? How do we sequence that? What does it mean for job creation? We don't know the answers to any of these questions. And here's the critical part. We don't have anybody in government asking them in ways that are answerable, right? And we don't have a structure to answer them. The idea behind a low carbon development commission is to create a non-executive body, and non-executive is key here, because if it's an executive body, and this comes now to parts of Indira's comments, we don't necessarily want the ministries to work smoothly with these ideas because we want transformative and disruptive change. If you bring the ministries into the conversation, they will pull, as they always do, existing ideas off the shelf. India is littered with missions and state action plans that are populated by chunks of text that have been pulled off the shelf. The question is, how do you change this up so you don't pull stuff off the shelf? So you ask the hard questions and you think about where you want to go. And, you know, as the old saying says, if you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there, right? This is part of the strategy setting impetus. So when you have if there are dissected, so let me just then shift. So the answer to the first question, to govern what? Well, we actually need to do that first part of the question asking to figure out what it means to develop a low carbon strategy, what that then means in terms of sectoral transitions, and then to figure out how to get there, right? Now, we looked at what other countries do. China does very much what both of you recommend. You basically say, we're going to plant this body in the equivalent of our Niti Aayog, which is their NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission. Their NDRC is a large, sprawling body that has networks out to universities and think tanks and has a huge technical apparatus, right? It also has hierarchical connections to all the ministries and has hierarchical connections to the states. So they can actually implement everything. We don't have anything analogous. The other extreme is the UK. The UK has an independent commission, right? But it is a climate carbon commission. It sets carbon budgets and it drives those budgets. It forces every ministry to come up with reports on how it will meet those budgets, and it reports to Parliament on how that is done. What we've done is taken a hybrid version. We said, look, we can't do this around carbon budgets. As Jairam said, low carbon, but not no carbon, right? We can't get to net zero on a dime and so on and so forth. But we can start bending the curve. The role of the LCDC is to be that provocateur. By being a non-executive body, the idea is that it is not threatening to the ministries. By being a deliberative body that includes media, labor, industry, and so on, it brings all these people into the conversation about what that might mean. So an LCD might convene a working group, for example, around the future of transport. It might convene a working group around low carbon agriculture and so on and so forth. And because it is non-executive, it has a prayer of actually bringing people together to consider ideas that go beyond what is already on the shelf. So that was our thought process. Now, you know, what is it necessary for such a body to have? It needs to be able to credibly convene. It needs to be able to analyze, and it needs to be independent, right? And as Indira said, you know, I don't want to get directly into the conversation about the Niti, but I will just say, if we think the Niti can do all three of those things, fine. We've laid out the objectives, right? At the moment, to give you, and I have nothing, you know, we in fact invited Rajiv Kumar to join this session. He was unfortunately not able to join, but let me just observe. India is trying to set at the moment a long-term strategy. India has in the past done modeling strategies, trying to figure out where we will go. There are two nodes where this happens. One in the Ministry of Environment and Forests, where they try and kind of coordinate with other bodies. And one, there's a modeling group in Niti Aayog. The modeling group in Niti Aayog has not produced anything for the last several years. And before that, it was a very useful spreadsheet model, right? So the ability to analyze has not fully been realized. The ability to convene is, and contra what Indira said, when we talk about short-termism, what we mean is that Niti's job is to be part of government and fulfill the objectives, including the short-term objectives. We need to have somebody that is able to detach itself from short-term political objectives. In the UK, the low carbon, climate change committee actually did an analysis looking at the prospects for net zero emissions and basically showed that it was a feasible trajectory for the UK at the time when the government was backpedaling, right? And that then led civil society and so on to step forward. So yes, an independent body can be threatening for a government, but from the point of view of thinking about what will actually create the forum for transformative change, that independence is really critical. So I just want to pick up a couple of phrases, right? So the fact that the LCDC may not have channels of communication, it may not actually be able to operate with feasibility and smoothness, that's actually precisely the point. Because if it operates with feasibility and smoothness, it won't have the space to actually create and generate new ideas. Let's look at where we're going, right? India has the prospect of avoiding lock-in to high carbon infrastructure and locking in low carbon infrastructure. That involves technological changes, institutional changes. If we're going to remake electricity, for example, in a low carbon direction, we have to rethink the role of the discoms. We have to rethink distributed electricity. There are all kinds of interests that are going to be threatened, right? If you are going to threaten interests, you don't want to do it by saying, here's an idea and we're going to implement it tomorrow. You want to actually open the door to conversation and see if other interests that have whose objectives lie in a low carbon future can be part of that conversation. Very much the objective here is to shift the political game here through which we both envision analytically and politically what the future holds. So that's the thought process behind all of this. Let me stop there, Yamini.
Thank you. Thanks, Navroz, for responding. I think you've opened it up for both panelists to respond. But relatedly, and I'm picking up a little bit on some of the questions that are coming in as well, so that we can make this as participatory as possible. An independent commission, if Jairam, you do buy the argument, would that even have teeth? If the overarching goal is to change the political game, does an independent commission have the ability to really shift internal discourse within the system?
I think we've had this discussion. An independent commission chaired by the Prime Minister, with a suitably professional technical backup, can certainly influence the discourse. It all depends on the bandwidth the Prime Minister of the day is able to provide, and what how much of time that the Prime Minister is able to give. But my experience is that Prime Ministers launch many things with great fanfare before that what is launched becomes a victim of the Prime Minister's office. Ultimately, it's the Prime Minister's office that drives these things. So I wouldn't like to have a commission that is dependent on an individual, on a person that is holding a particular post. That's why I prefer it to be located in the Planning Commission, all of the Planning Commission, the Niti Aayog. There is some merit to having an independent commission. It elevates the importance. It gives a signal that you consider this very, very significant. But to work out the intersectoral linkages with transport, with electricity, with agriculture, it's going to be a nightmare if it's an independent commission. I started my career in government 35 years ago, 1983, with an independent commission. It was India's first independent, it was not called commission, it was a board. It was headed by a cabinet minister reporting directly to the Prime Minister. It was a board on energy, pretty much what we are discussing today. And it got wound up in 2.5 years' time, basically because it was distinct from the Planning Commission. And it was not able to establish the institutional linkages which were creating the demand for energy. So, having an independent commission, if this commission is going to be an academic research think tank, policy, throwing out policy options body, and then depend on others to do the advocacy and the implementation, it's a complicated structure. So I'm not entirely persuaded by this idea of having an independent standalone LCDC, even though I think in the structure that Navroz is proposing, it is headed by the Prime Minister. It's chaired by the Prime Minister. But this could well be one of those things that the Prime Minister may buy. Internationally, it's a great calling card when you go to Glasgow and you say that I've set up a low carbon development commission. It's a great talking point. And India's approach to global negotiations is always based on talking points. We set up the National Action Plan on Climate Change so that we could get these international guys off our backs. Our strategy on climate change is somewhat different from the Chinese strategy. The Chinese strategy is act domestically, but pontificate internationally. Whereas our strategy is pontificate internationally, and take that pontification seriously domestically, which is completely wrong. So you want to get action, you want to get interventions in different areas of climate change, whether it's sea levels, whether it's deforestation, whether it's glaciers, whether it's the monsoon. So I'm not entirely convinced that one LCDC is going to be, an effective instrument for churning out these policy options.
Indira, your response, but also, one of Navroz's response to Jairam's question about the substantive governance, what exactly are we governing? Navroz is essentially saying we actually need to build out a strategy so we know what we need to govern. So in a sense, he's saying we need to have a plan, but we abandon planning at some level. So how do we think about that? And is it possible to do this in an institution like NITI, which actually doesn't have a financial relationship across line departments, or even in an independent commission, which doesn't, ultimately it is the Ministry of Finance that is determining budgetary allocation. So how do these square, or do they not at all?
Let me begin by congratulating Navroz for the robustness of his pushback and for the fact that he still retains his conviction that an independent LCDC is going to work. Navroz, I totally accept the fact that our policy, not just in this, but in all spheres, seriously lacks coherence. No one can question that. At the same time, if you imagine that an independent commission is going to bring in that coherence, that it is going to be useful to define our strategy and to bring about coherence in that, I mean, notwithstanding your conviction, I just don't see how that can happen. In order for them, for the strategies to cohere, this independent commission has to engage with all the thinking that has gone on so far in respect of each of those components, whether it's power sector reform or the modal mix and transformation in transportation, sorry. And it has to figure out why it was that in each one of those sectors, there was a lack of coherence. And this gets me to what I wanted to say about the second draft, which Yamini, shall I go ahead with that?
Yes, please.
Okay. My objection to your second draft was not that I disagreed with anything you said. You have that wonderful matrix. It's great. It looks great. But my criticism of that is that draft on the federal aspect of this progress towards climate targets has been written about in an ahistorical manner. By that I mean that you have not brought in strands of our history in terms of persuading or incentivizing states to do particular things, which in and of themselves were perfectly coherent. So for instance, we have had coherent efforts by the center to move the states towards power sector reform. You cannot challenge the coherence of that particular effort, that particular strategy in that sector. And yet those efforts failed. They failed not just once, but repeatedly. They failed with Uday. And last year in Atmanirbhar, let me take a very recent example. I'm not saying that looking at history, you have to go back to ancient history or anything, but just look at last year's Atmanirbhar. What did we have? If I have 2 minutes, I'll go into the details of that. Yamini, shall I go ahead? So we had an offer to states. Among the many pieces of Atmanirbhar, this one piece was perfectly coherent. What it said was that the borrowing capacity of states would be increased by 2% of their respective GSDP if they did, if they move towards reform in one of 4 areas. Now, of that 2%, 1% became unconditional. So let's forget about that. And let's just stay with the 1% which remained conditional in 4 pieces, which is to say each one of those avenues of reform would carry a reward in terms of an increase by 0.25% of the respective GSDP of states in their borrowing capacity. They were borrowing, of course. It was not a grant. It was a borrowing enabling provision, but still it was attractive at a time when they were hurting very badly fiscally. So what do we know from the response of states? We know that of the 4 avenues of reform, the one that they responded to the most energetically and very quickly was ease of doing business. And that is because in the priorities of states, they see the advantage to themselves of encouraging business and having more economic activity within their jurisdictions, increasing their revenue and so on. So that is something that is now aligned with the objectives of states. It's perfectly aligned with the national desire also to improve ease of doing business. What was the least responded to? And that is really very, very pertinent from the viewpoint of what we are discussing today. The least response was to power sector reform. That was the one which got response rates, and it in turn was broken into three bits. One of them, which was about reducing AT&C losses, it got a response of 8% in terms of what was on offer, the increment in borrowing capacity. States are not interested in that. So what do you need to do? You need to learn from these historical responses by states, whether it is in the area of forestry. On forestry, I've written a paper on the states' responses with Manish Gupta of NIPFP. They vary greatly in terms of their responses. And tragically for us, and this is relevant for climate targets, tragically for us, the most forested states like Arunachal Pradesh are the ones who have responded the least. In fact, forested area in Arunachal Pradesh has actually gone down. The area transferred to non-forest uses is the highest in Arunachal Pradesh, and they have not even bothered to use the CAMPA funding for compensatory afforestation. They've not even bothered to use that. Whereas other states which were much less forested leapt at the incentives that were offered, and they did increase their forested area. So responses vary. We need to have a historical understanding of that, sector by sector. And then this LCD commission or cell or whatever it is has to bring all those pieces together, understand states, understand their priorities, and then shape the incentives in such a way that we will get to where we want to get. So I think the clue to getting more coherence and more substance to our deliberations is actually to look at history, to see how the past schemes have succeeded or more often failed, and to pick up from there. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Indra. In fact, Navroz, you yourself have been a student of India's power sector reform, so maybe you could sort of comment a little bit on that history and how that speaks to your thinking on the federal question. I'm also picking up one of the questions that are coming in from the Q&A box for you to respond to. Navroz, you spoke about structures in China and the UK, but one of our audience is asking about thinking going on in Canada, Germany, or the US, which are also sort of federal systems, and can you reflect a little bit on whether there are learnings that we can draw from there as well?
Thanks so much, Yamini, and thank you again for this round from both the panelists. I just want to start by correcting a couple of slight misapprehensions about what we put out there. We are actually not suggesting that the PM chair the LCDC. Because we feel that really the idea of it is not to be a political body, but a technical and deliberative body. And then I think Jairam asked a very good question. Well, who would pay attention to it? Why would anybody care? And I think that's a fair question. And our idea is, and this is where it's very important for it to be law-backed. If it's in a statute, the LCDC is more likely to be taken seriously. But the law we're suggesting also mandates, and this is a deliberately nudge strategy, it mandates that every ministry prepare a response to the ideas put out by the LCDC in its domain, and that these responses and the LCDC's comment on those responses be tabled before Parliament, right? So what we're very much trying to do is use the LCDC structure as a deliberative structure and as a hub for and Indra asked the question, how on earth would it manage coherence? There are, how would it look at all these sectors and so on and so forth? What we find as a think tank, and I've worked with many other think tanks in this area, we go to the relevant line ministry. Every think tank shows up at these line ministries with their ideas. For example, when renewable energy was hot right before Paris, different think tanks showed up with order of magnitude different estimates of costs. And the ministry did not have the ability to reconcile those numbers, right? So the LCDC then becomes, in a sense, a kind of low carbon adda also, right? It becomes the place where we can actually hash these things out. And that's why it's important, A, that it be independent and non-executive, so it's non-threatening. but B, that ministries are actually mandated not to take on board their ideas, but to engage with them in a way that is public. So if the ministry puts out something that is a not well thought through or not well considered response, that is in the public domain for the think tanks and for Jairam and his tweets and others to get his teeth into, right? So it becomes a platform for deliberation and conversation. We simply don't have a place where we have a conversation about how all this happens. Now on the chat, Daljit has asked the question, why do you want a low carbon development commission? Why not just a development commission? And the point is, the reason a low carbon development commission is, India clearly wants to develop. There is no high carbon trajectory to development anymore because of climate change. If we do a high carbon trajectory, we are both contributing to the problem and we will be a technologically backward society because globally we're moving to a low carbon future. So there isn't an option of high carbon development. Hence it's called a low carbon development commission, right? With the emphasis on the development, but in a low carbon way. Now, I think Indira made a really good point about the sort of the ahistorical, potentially ahistorical tone of the brief. I will just point her and everybody else to the fact that, and I should say, give the backdrop to this project. This will also allow me to answer Rob Stowe's question. This has come out of a 2.5-year-long process where we have looked at climate institutions in 8 different countries, 4 developed and 4 developing. Those detailed papers are coming out as a special issue of the journal Environmental Politics. And I'll ask Aditya to post the link on the website. 6 of the papers are already out, including the India paper. There is also a separate academic paper on the federal story, Indira, which does get into the historical detail. But to get to your point, I think what you pull out very correctly when you look at the history is that states do things that work for them politically. They will not do things that don't work for them politically, hence Uday and so on and so forth, which was very much the thrust of the volume several of us, including Parth, who was part of this brief, put out a few years ago called Mapping Power, right? And so we agree with that states will take on what works for them politically. The question is, do we have a sufficiently robust set of ideas for them to engage with on what might work politically? And that's again where the LCDC is important, right? The LCDC puts out ideas for states to consider and can directly advise if requested by the states, so that states can figure out for themselves what works politically, but they're not doing it in a vacuum. They're doing it in a context where there are a set of ideas put out there. There is an adda for them to plug into. We need to actually build a conversation. Building a low carbon society is not easy. There's not a single path. There are trade-offs. There are complex politics. This is meant to kind of facilitate that conversation so that over time, low carbon interests start seeing spaces for articulating their voices. And over time, that ministries start seeing that they will become more powerful. Rob Stowe on the chat brought up the example of other industrialized countries. Germany is a really interesting case. Germany has a green party. Low carbon is politically very popular in Germany, but they were not able to do anything for a decade. They call it the lost decade of climate policy in Germany. This is what the paper that was as part of a project suggests, because the big German automobile companies were not willing to do that. Now, Germany has this corporatist governance system where industry, labor, and government sit down together, and they were unable to break out of the cozy accommodation that the German vehicle industry actually had reached with the ministry. What has changed is civil society pressure and the creation of a commission in Germany that puts out alternatives that eventually forces the transport ministry in Germany to consider different ways of doing things, right? So we have to shake the system loose a little bit is the sentiment, and I just entirely agree with Indira that we have to enable states to find things that work within their politics, and their politics are different state by state.
Jairam, would love to hear your comments on the state politics aspect of it, and how does one even begin to get there?
You know, I am confused now. Navroz, if I understand Navroz right, Parliament will pass a law establishing an LCDC, right? And the accountability will be to Parliament. This is a recipe for disaster. It's nobody is going to listen to this body. It will be another one of those institutions that has been set up. And it will be, a ritual will be performed. If you want this body to be effective, it has to be chaired by the Prime Minister. Let's be very brutally honest about it. That's the way our system functions. And you can't use the LCDC as an instrument for governance reform on a larger level. We have to be cognizant of the political economy. The political economy is that our governance structure is dominated by the prime ministerial form of government. We are a parliament, but to think that you can empower institute. Look at the National Green Tribunal. The National Green Tribunal was created by an act of parliament. And look the state of the way the government is trying to undercut and emasculate the National Green Tribunal. So I don't understand how a body that is going to be empowered by parliament is going to be taken seriously in our system, frankly. The reason why the Planning Commission was taken seriously for 35 years, even though it was an executive order that set up the Planning Commission, it was not by an act of parliament, was because the Prime Minister chaired the Planning Commission. And that's what gave Planning Commission the weight that it had in the 50s. And the 60s were a lost decade for us. It was a lost decade for planning. It was not a lost decade for the Planning Commission. But the 70s, the Planning Commission once again recovered. And that's because the Prime Minister invested a lot of authority in that. So if you want to have an LCDC, it has to be chaired by the Prime Minister.
It's stuck. Oops. Sorry, I think something happened to my internet there. Indira, you wanted to comment on that?
Just to, I find that Jairam and I are on the same page as far as this goes. I think that, having a mandate that ministries should respond to the LCDC's recommendations and place those in Parliament will just be treated as yet another nuisance by the line ministries. You have to remember that whatever may be the incoherence of public policy in India, the top bureaucrats in the major ministries, in all the ministries at both central and states, are heavily overworked. So what this will mean will be just one more thing for them to do, just like they treat responses to the Right to Information Act as just another nuisance that they have to attend to. But I don't think your intent, which is to improve the coherence of public policy, at least in this area of climate targets and so on, I don't think that will be achieved. You have to understand the Indian system. You have to work within it. Niti Aayog is functioning. It's producing all these ranks. In various areas, cities are being ranked, and those ranks are paid attention to. Cities do care about raising their ranking in that league. So there are some things that are being done. And the reason I'm referring to those rankings is because it's addressing that very issue of state priorities. States may have different political priorities, but on the other hand, they want to look good in that ranking too. So in that sense, I think the Niti Aayog did hit on something that will actually work, that will actually incentivize states to do better. So the Indian system inches its way in its own fashion towards what will work. But I just don't think, I don't want to throw cold water on this idea of yours, but I just don't see it working, frankly. And I want to refer to one other thing. Several times, both in the oral presentation and in your drafts, you refer to India as being a centralized federal system. In practice, it's really not all that centralized. As you can see from all the centrally sponsored schemes, central plan schemes, all the various UDAYs and whatnot, the center has not been able to enforce its will upon the states. States have responded to these incentives as they choose to, as they see fit. It is in fact a very open federation in which states do flout these incentives and systems and schemes that are thrown at them, unless they happen to be aligned with state incentives. So this business of understanding state incentives is terribly important. And at the end of the day, that is a political process. It's a process whereby the center and states have to understand each other politically. But there is one important respect in your second draft in which I wholly endorse what you say. And that is the need for interstate communication. During our last two disastrous encounters with the COVID virus, there have been times in which, for instance, in the first wave, Kerala did very, very well. And if what they did had been available on an interstate portal for other states to see, they could very easily have implemented what Kerala did. There's no problem at all. But this information was not to be had. The Ministry of Health at the center was not publicizing what Kerala was doing. In the second wave, again, there are some states that did much better than others. But once again, what they did was not available for all to see. So I think interstate communication, I totally endorse that aspect of what you say in the second draft, absolutely has to be improved. An open portal on which they can learn from each other. And I think that is how coherence can slowly be built up in the federation. But it's not a very centralized federation.
I think we're coming to the last few minutes of our conversation, but I did want to bring in both Jairam and you, Indira, on this question of local governments. We've talked about center state in the context of federalism. We haven't spoken about local governments. It's of course not yet at the heart of the briefs, but I think both of you have mentioned this, and it is an important issue to bring up in the context of these conversations. So just your thoughts. I mean, we do have the sort of every level of government loves to decentralize only up to their level challenge. But, we cannot think about climate without at least talking about our cities. And I would argue same for panchayats too. So are there ways of thinking about this differently?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Start with you and then
let Jairam go, then I'll follow.
No, go ahead, Indira.
Okay.
Go ahead, Indira.
Okay. Once again, if you want to refer to recent history, let's go back to Atmanirbhar, last year's Atmanirbhar, and that same borrowing incentive in 4 pieces that I was talking about. One piece was for EODB, one piece was for power sector reform, another piece was for local body reform. And that local body reform was the second from the bottom in terms of states' responses. That already tells you something, that local body reform is simply not important enough for states to take it seriously. And the tragedy of the recent provisions which have been made by the 15th Finance Commission for local bodies, as you know, they've made very extravagant provisions for local bodies and for primary health, to be diagnostic facilities and so on to be improved. At the end of the day, it is the states which have to engage with the center and report that XYZ as preconditions have been met in order to get those statutory flows. These are even statutory flows. But my hunch is, I hope I'm wrong, but I think these flows just will not happen by virtue of the fact that the states are not going to meet those prior conditionalities in order for those statutory grants to flow. And that is the great tragedy of the system. Unless we learn to incentivize states to do local body reform, unless they see that local body reform is actually good for them, the states, it's not going to happen. And this is a political process. It has to be politically driven by someone who is convinced that local body reform is good for states and wants to push them in that direction. But I totally agree that we cannot think in terms of climate targets without involving local bodies and all the other things. And I totally agree with Jairam also that there are so many other things like pollution and so on, which we are not even looking at. But all of those have to be addressed at local levels. So we are very far away from achieving coherence. And the way to that coherence, unfortunately, has to be driven by powerful and convinced political leadership.
Jairam, our politics today is even more centralized than it has been, I think, ever before in some ways. Is it possible to find a political answer to the challenge of local governance that, as Indira articulated?
Well, I think so. I think, Yamini, if we look at questions of climate, if we look at questions of ecological imbalance, like the loss of biodiversity, pollution, contamination, if we cease looking at them as environmental issues and start looking at them as public health issues, you will get greater political traction, both at the federal level as well as at the state level. One of the great weaknesses of our approach to the environmental issues, sustainability issues, is they have been posed as environmental issues, and therefore they come across as being of relevance in the medium to long term. Whereas it's now become obvious, and COVID 19 has made it even more obvious that the morbidity and the mortality impacts of what we consider to be environmental issues really predominate. And I think this is how you get alliances, this is how you get coalitions, this is how you get governments to think. We should look upon these as public health challenge. The climate change is a public health challenge. The loss of biodiversity is a public health challenge. And of course, today everybody recognizes pollution is a public health challenge. So I think that the starting point is how do you communicate this? How do you build a larger political constituency for these issues that we are talking about? And I have been saying this, for the last many years. But I'm glad now, in the last 2 years particularly, the realization, even before COVID-19, if you remember, Yamini, pollution, people had begun to take pollution seriously because of the public health impacts, and which are becoming very apparent, not just in Delhi, but in city after city. So I think the public health angle, we need to anchor these issues in the public health anchor, and then ask ourselves the question: how do you build the capacity of local governments? Now, for example, in the 73rd Amendment, the Gram Panchayats, thanks to the Mahatma Gandhi Narega, which was really the first major intervention that had the Gram Panchayat, as the focal point. And not only did it build the financial resource base of the Gram Panchayat, but also, gave the Gram Panchayats a central role in the program. So we need to create these types of programs for. See, I think one of the great paradoxes, I don't know whether it's a paradox or not, because I think it's part of our political economy. Politically, panchayats are taken far more seriously than nagarpalikas. Chief ministers are loath to implement the 74th Amendment, but chief ministers would gladly take credit for implementing the 73rd Amendment, however imperfect and incomplete that implementation is. So we need to look at the 74th Amendment once again very, very seriously, Yamini. And this, I think the 74th Amendment, COVID-19 has given it a certain relevance, and climate will give it even greater relevance, because much of the problems that we are talking about, which are related to climate governance, really fall fairly and squarely in the domain of urban self-government bodies.
Navroz, the last word to you, and your thoughts also on the local government issue.
Yes, thanks, Yamini. Let me start with that. I completely agree, and it's good that this panel is in violent agreement on some things. That a lot of this is going to rest with local government, and both on the adaptation and mitigation angles. I think cities are particularly important. We sort of mention it in this brief, but just because of space and so on and so forth, we haven't gone that deeply into it. Let me just pick up on something that Jairam said and agree with that as well. Pollution as a health story has indeed been really important, and I think it speaks to also Indira's point about both in states and cities. What wins public support is what is going to get implemented and sold, and what wins public support is not something that is predetermined. It can be changed over time as the pollution and health story goes. So how do you change some of these things over time? Well, partly you change it by building narratives backed by analysis, right? So with that long preamble, let me take one more shot at the rationale behind this idea. We are basically saying we need a governance structure that doesn't just make the existing wheels of government work a little bit better. We have been locked into incremental change, and occasionally we've got lucky. There are serendipitous change opportunistically, for example, with renewable energy. Interestingly, what happened with the renewable energy story is the mission that was created, the renewable energy mission, created little institutional structure that then got populated by enterprising bureaucrats and renewable energy companies and so on and so forth. We've learned from that.
Navroz, can I interrupt you for 1 minute? Just 1 minute.
Always, Jairam.
I can't resist saying this. Institutions had nothing to do with our renewable energy push. It was technology. You could have had the most, outlandish of institutions, but the dramatic way in which the prices of solar panels has
fallen.
Sorry,
Jairam. No. Sorry. Back in 2009, renewable energy technology was nowhere when the 20 gigawatt target came up, right? But of course, subsequently, technology has taken over. Okay, but we'll come back to this. The point is the argument. So we can come back on that, Jairam. But I think it's for me, any of these changes is always three things, right? It's ideas, it's interests, and it's institutions. No single one of those things can bring about the change. They may weigh differently at different times, but it's always those three things. But just to come back to the push, right? I guess the structure we're suggesting here is saying, look, the combination of voice, right, creating new narratives, and having a body that has the heft to inject new narratives is going to be quite important in shifting politics, including at the city level. We need to have, and this comes out of a couple of decades now, not as many as either Indira or Jairam in part of these conversations, but I have seen too many cases where whoever gets the ear of the most close by joint secretary wins the battle. Whoever gets the business card first, and that idea just takes sway. Which is why, for example, and I think Jairam will agree with this, in the case of the solar story, we didn't think about job creation at all, right? We should have actually thought about solar in ways that also looked at creation of jobs. We didn't have an all things considered body, and we have now a very robust environment of think tanks. We have so many voices and very few ears capable of digesting all that information. We need to more deliberately build these strategies and provide spaces also for civil society, think tanks, and others to actually engage in this conversation. We need some kind of hub. I'm fine with putting it in NITI, but what I will push back on is, let's please not just have an existing body that is structured to do things in incremental ways, grease the skids of ministries and enable them to pull things off the shelf. We need to shake this up a little bit. Maybe this idea is a bridge too far, but if we take some of the elements of it, independence, analytical capacity, and deliberation, if you have another way to bring those three things in, I'm all in.
I have to give Aditya the opportunity to weigh in as well before we finally close. Aditya, very quickly to you. Aditya, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, just two things. The first is, I think the story of the Climate Change Committee in the UK, which has sort of stolen the airwaves about what an institution looks like, is actually quite instructive, because all these concerns about independence and how did it sway the public debate and how did it sway government ministries and so on were very much alive and kicking in 2008 when they set this up. And we had the chair of the CCC at a previous event, and what he said was very interesting. He said those first 3-4 years, the first commissioner came in and had to build linkages with the ministries, earn their trust, like Dr. Rajaraman said, had to build linkages with civil society and NGOs, had to build linkages with the media. And that really is where they derive their power from. So this can't be a government body that sits isolated in a world unto its own. This is very much about integrating itself into society and making itself relevant. It has to have its elbows out. Otherwise, there's really no chance. Something within the executive will be captured. Something outside the executive will be irrelevant. So you need something special to happen. I don't think we're not in ignorance of that fact. And the second part is a lot of the presentation was actually about the financial incentives for low carbon policy. And that really, I think, is thumb on the scales what will shift us, move us towards creating demand for LCDC analysis. Because we're quite aware that there's no one's going to listen to it and overturn their own interests as a minister or as a secretary without something pushing them to do so. And we debated internally about budgetary allocations. We talked about the Finance Commission. We talked about central sector schemes. So those are the nuts and bolts of actually shifting incentives and therefore the political economy. So I just wanted to say these two things. Yeah, thanks. You're on mute, Yamini. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Aditya. Thanks, Navroz. Thanks, Jairam and Indira. The purpose behind this conversation was really to provoke a larger debate on questions of governance and institutions for what a climate-ready state should be. I think we've certainly provoked and both provoked and critiqued, and in that process, strengthened at least the platforms for deliberation and dialogue, which is precisely what I think Navroz and Aditya are hoping for government to do as well as we move forward on this very, very challenging trajectory. Thanks a lot for what has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and looking forward for more provocations on this from Navroz and Aditya and more deliberations with all of you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Navroz.
Thank you, Jairam and Indra. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Yamini.
Bye.